The baby's cry cut through the silence like a knife. Reed Carter sat on the cold floorboards of his cabin, cradling his newborn son against his chest. The child's wails were raw, desperate, hungry. Reed rocked him gently, but his arms felt weak, his movements clumsy. He had no idea what he was doing. His wife had died 3 hours ago. The midwife had left at dawn, her face grave and apologetic. She'd wrapped the body, said a prayer, and told Reed she would send word to the preacher. Then she'd gone, taking the lantern's warmth with her. Now it was just Reed and the baby. Samuel, his wife, had chosen the name 2 months before, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her smile soft and certain. She would never see him grow. Reed looked down at the child in his arms. Samuel's face was red and scrunched, his tiny fists trembling. He was so small, so fragile. Reed had built the cradle beside the bed with his own hands, sanding every edge smooth, carving his wife's initials into the headboard. He'd imagined her sitting there, nursing the baby, humming the lullabies her mother had taught her. But the cradle sat empty now, and Reed didn't know how to feed a newborn. Outside, the blizzard howled. Snow piled against the cabin walls, seeping through cracks in the wood. The wind rattled the shutters and moaned through the eaves. Reed glanced toward the window. He couldn't see past the glass. The world had disappeared into white. The stove fire was dying. Reed shifted Samuel to one arm and reached for another log. His hands shook as he fed it into the flames. The heat was fading fast and he had maybe 3 more logs left. After that, he'd have to go outside, dig through the snow, find the wood pile buried somewhere near the back of the cabin, but he couldn't leave the baby alone, not even for a minute. Samuel wailed louder, his little body arching in Reed's arms. Reed stood, pacing the narrow room, bouncing the child the way he'd seen his wife do with neighbors' babies. It didn't work. The crying only grew sharper, more frantic. "I know," Reed whispered, his voice cracking. "I know you're hungry. I don't know what to do." He tried giving Samuel water from a cloth. The baby had choked and screamed. Reed had no milk, no way to get any. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Callahan, 2 miles west, but the trail was buried. He couldn't make it on foot, not in this storm. And even if he couldn't carry a newborn through a blizzard. They were trapped. Reed sank down beside the cradle, still holding Samuel close. The baby's cries had grown weaker now, more tired. Reed felt his own exhaustion pulling at him like a weight. He hadn't slept since his wife's labor began 2 nights ago. He'd held her hand through the pain, whispered promises he couldn't keep, begged God for mercy that never came. Now he was alone, and his son was dying in his arms. "I'm sorry," Reed whispered, his forehead pressed to Samuel's. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how to do this without her." The fire popped softly on the stove. The wind screamed outside and Reed Carter, 26 years old and hollowed out by grief, bowed his head and prayed for a miracle he didn't believe would come. Then through the storm came a knock at the door. Reed's head snapped up. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. The wind played tricks sometimes, rattling loose boards, throwing branches against the walls. But then it came again. 3 deliberate knocks, firm and clear. Someone was outside. Reed stood carefully, Samuel still whimpering against his shoulder. He crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled open the door. A gust of wind and snow hit him like a fist, and he had to squint against the white. A figure stood on his porch, bundled in a heavy wool coat, face nearly hidden by a scarf. Snow clung to every fold of fabric. For a heartbeat, Reed couldn't tell who it was. Then the scarf came down. "Mr. Carter," the woman said quietly. Her voice was steady despite the cold. "I heard what happened." Red stared. "Miss Doyle." Margaret Doyle was the school teacher from the settlement 3 miles east. Reed had seen her in town a handful of times. Young, soft-spoken, always carrying books under her arm. She taught the children their letters in a 1-room schoolhouse near the church. He'd never spoken more than a few polite words to her. And now she was standing on his porch in the middle of a blizzard. "I came as soon as I could," Margaret said. Her cheeks were windburned, her lips pale. "May I come in?" Reed stepped aside without a word. Margaret moved past him, brushing snow from her coat. She carried a leather satchel pressed close to her chest, protecting it from the storm. Reed shut the door behind her, and the cabin fell into sudden, muffled silence. Margaret looked around quickly, taking in the scene, the dying fire, the cradle, the bed in the corner still unmade. Her eyes lingered on Samuel, and something softened in her expression. "How long has he been crying?" she asked. "Hours," Reed said hoarsely. "I can't." I don't have any way to feed him. Margaret set the satchel on the table and unwound her scarf. I brought milk, she said simply. Fresh this morning. I kept it wrapped and closed to keep it from freezing. Reed felt something crack open in his chest. He couldn't speak. Margaret moved with quiet efficiency. She opened the satchel and pulled out a small glass bottle wrapped in cloth along with a tin cup and a clean rag. She poured a small amount of milk into the cup and set it near the stove to warm. Then she turned to Reed, her hands outstretched. May I? Reed hesitated. Samuel was the only thing he had left of his wife, the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. But the baby was crying again, weak and desperate, and Reed had nothing to give him. He placed Samuel in Margaret's arms. She cradled the child gently, adjusting his blanket, her touch careful and sure. Samuel squirmed for a moment, then seemed to sense something different, someone who knew what they were doing. Margaret tested the milk with her finger, then dipped the corner of the rag into the cup. She touched Samuel's lips. The baby latched on immediately. Reed watched, stunned, as his son drank. Margaret worked patiently, dipping the rag again and again, letting Samuel feed at his own pace. The crying stopped. The cabin filled with the soft sounds of nursing, the crackle of the fire, the wind outside. Margaret glanced up at Reed. When did you last eat? I don't remember. And sleep. Reed shook his head. Margaret's expression was firm but kind. Then you'll do both. Now I'll tend to him. Miss Doyle, I can't ask you to. You didn't ask, she said quietly. Let me help. Reed didn't argue. He sank onto the bench by the table, his body suddenly too heavy to hold upright. Margaret moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, still cradling Samuel in one arm. She added another log to the stove, adjusted the damper, and stirred the coals until the flames rose higher. Warmth began to spread through the room again. Samuel had stopped crying entirely. His tiny eyes were half closed, his breathing soft and even. Margaret settled into the rocking chair near the fire, the one Reed's wife had sat in every evening while mending clothes. It felt strange to see someone else there. Wrong, almost, but also somehow right. Margaret looked down at the baby, her expression gentle. He's beautiful, she said softly. Reed's throat tightened. His mother wanted to name him Samuel after her father. It suits him. Silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Margaret rocked, slowly, the chair creaking in rhythm. Samuel's breathing deepened. He was asleep. How did you know? Reed asked finally. About my wife. Mrs. Callahan sent her boy to the settlement yesterday before the storm got bad. Margaret said. He told us what happened. I packed what I could and left at first light. Reed stared at her. You walked 3 miles in a blizzard. It wasn't so bad when I started. The worst hit about halfway. She said it matter-of-factly as if risking her life was the most ordinary thing in the world. You could have died out there. Margaret glanced at him, her eyes calm. So could he. Reed didn't know what to say to that. He looked down at his hands, calloused, dirt-stained, still trembling slightly. He built this cabin with these hands, cleared the land, raised the walls, made a home for the family he thought he'd have. And now that family was gone, except for a child he didn't know how to keep alive. I don't know what I'm doing, he said quietly. No one does at first, Margaret replied. But you'll learn. What if I can't? She looked at him, then really looked at him, and Reed saw something in her face he hadn't expected. Certainty. You will, she said, because you have to. Samuel stirred in her arms, making a soft sound. Margaret adjusted his blanket, tucking it more snugly around him. He'll need to eat again in a few hours. I brought enough milk for today and tomorrow, but after that, you'll need to arrange something with one of the nursing mothers in town. Mrs. Ricks might help, or Mrs. Callahan if you can reach her once the storm clears. Reed nodded slowly. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Hadn't been able to think past the next minute, the next breath. There's bread in my satchel, Margaret continued. And some dried meat. You should eat something. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. Her tone left no room for argument. Reed reached for the satchel and found the food wrapped in cloth. He forced himself to take a bite of bread. It tasted like sawdust, but he chewed and swallowed. Then another bite. His body seemed to wake up, reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten. Margaret watched him for a moment, then turned her attention back to Samuel. When did you last sleep? 2 days, maybe 3. Then you'll sleep now. I'll watch him. Reed shook his head. I can't ask you to stay. You're not asking. I'm telling you. Margaret's voice was gentle but unyielding. You're no good to him if you collapse. So you'll eat and then you'll rest. I'll wake you if he needs you. Reed wanted to protest, wanted to say he couldn't accept this much kindness from a near stranger. But his body was already giving in, exhaustion pulling at him like an undertow. Just for an hour, he murmured. As long as you need, Margaret said. Reed woke to the sound of humming. For a confused moment, he thought his wife was there, that the last 2 days had been a terrible dream. But when he opened his eyes, he saw Margaret sitting by the fire, Samuel cradled in her arms. She was humming a melody Reed didn't recognize, something low and soothing. The baby was awake, but quiet, staring up at her with dark, unfocused eyes. The cabin was warm. The storm still raged outside, but inside everything felt strangely peaceful. Reed sat up slowly, his back stiff from sleeping on the narrow bed. The light through the window was dim and gray. Late afternoon, maybe early evening. He'd slept for hours. Margaret glanced over. You're awake. I didn't mean to sleep that long. You needed it. She stood carefully, carrying Samuel toward him. He's been fed twice, changed once. He's doing well. Reed took his son, and Samuel made a small noise, his face scrunching, but he didn't cry. Reed looked down at him, this tiny person who turned his world inside out, and felt something shift in his chest. Not love yet, he was too numb for that. But maybe the beginning of it. The possibility. Thank you, Reed said quietly. Margaret nodded. She moved to the table and began repacking her satchel. Reed watched her, suddenly aware of how much she'd done. Fed his son. Keep the fire going. Let him rest. She'd given him something he thought he'd lost. A few hours of peace. The storm should break by morning, Margaret said. I'll need to head back then, but I can come again in a few days. Bring more milk and supplies. Reed frowned. Miss Doyle, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She turned to face him, her expression serious. But winter's hard, Mr. Carter, especially alone. And especially with a newborn. She paused. I'd like to help, if you'll let me. Reed didn't know what to say. Pride warred with desperation. He'd always taken care of himself, never asked for charity. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about Samuel. I'd be grateful, he said finally. Something softened in Margaret's face. Then it settled. The days that followed blurred together. The storm cleared and Margaret returned to the settlement. But 3 days later, she came back. She brought fresh milk, a pot of beef broth, and clean clothes for the baby. She stayed for an afternoon, teaching Reed how to swaddle Samuel properly, how to recognize when he was hungry versus when he just needed comfort. Hold him close to your chest, she instructed, guiding Reed's arms. He can hear your heartbeat. It calms him. Reed did as she said, and Samuel's fussing quieted. Margaret smiled. There, you're learning. She came again the following week, and the week after that. Each visit she brought something: food, blankets, firewood she'd paid the miller boy to haul. She showed Reed how to warm milk to the right temperature, how to check if Samuel had a fever, and how to soothe him when nothing else worked. Slowly, the cabin changed. The oppressive weight of grief began to lift, replaced by something steadier. Routine purpose. Reed learned to anticipate Samuel's needs, to read his cries, to function on broken sleep. The baby grew stronger, his cries louder, his grip firmer, and Margaret became a constant presence. She'd arrive in the late morning, her cheeks pink from the cold, always carrying something in her arms. She'd sit by the fire and talk while Reed worked, about her students, about books she'd read, about nothing in particular. Her voice filled the silence that had threatened to swallow him whole. Reed found himself listening for her footsteps on the porch, found himself straightening the cabin before she arrived as if her opinion mattered. Found himself noticing things: the way she tilted her head when Samuel cooped, the way she hummed without realizing it, the way her hands moved with such gentle certainty. By the time February arrived, Margaret's visits had become woven into the fabric of Reed's life. She came twice a week, sometimes 3 times when the weather allowed. She'd knock softly, let herself in, and immediately reach for Samuel, who had begun to recognize her. The baby would kick his legs and make soft noises when he saw her, his small face brightening in a way that made Reed's chest ache. He knows you, Reed said one afternoon, watching Margaret cradle his son. Of course he does. Margaret smiled down at Samuel, touching his tiny nose with her finger. Don't you, sweet boy? Samuel grabbed her finger and held on tight. Margaret laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth Reed hadn't felt in months. He realized with a strange jolt that he was smiling, too. But not everyone in town smiled when they spoke of Margaret Doyle's visits. Reed first heard the whispers when he went into the general store for supplies. He was waiting for Mr. Harris to weigh out cornmeal when he caught fragments of conversation from two women.